To this evening's webinar. Myself and Dr. Duran at Performance Horse Nutrition and the whole Poulin Grain team are really excited to bring this new technology to you. I know it seems like everybody's at a standstill at the moment, but a lot of great things been happening behind the scenes, and we're excited to share them with you tonight. So a little bit of housekeeping first. Myself, Dr. Tanya Cubitt, with Performance Horse Nutrition, I will be the presenter this evening. But Dr. Stephen Duran, founder and owner of Performance Horse Nutrition, will be answering questions live. So let's go ahead and get started. And tonight we're going to talk about chromium, a new ingredient that we're going to be adding to the feeds. So before we get into the source of chromium that we're using, I just want to spend a minute here to talk about chromium itself and what is it. It's not something that we talk about often, but it's a trace mineral. It's needed in very small amounts, but it is really, really important. It plays a huge role in glucose and insulin metabolism and energy production, as we will see as we go through. The research has shown that the organic form is more bioavailable than the inorganic form, as we see in many of the other minerals that we use. So we're using an organic form. Chromium itself is used to help keep blood sugar levels normal, and the way it does that is by improving the way the body uses insulin. Now that is a very simplistic way of looking at it, but that's really the nuts and bolts of it. Chromium is going to improve the role of insulin. Research in horses has been done on chromium since the mid-90s. As early as 1997, researchers looked at chromium requirements for exercising horses and suggested maybe they have a higher requirement than those doing no exercise. And as we understand better the role of chromium and how it may actually be able to push more glucose into the cell, and glucose is an energy substrate for these heavily exercising horses, you can understand that maybe those horses had a higher requirement or need for chromium. So this isn't a new nutrient and the research isn't new, but what is new is KemTRACE chromium, and that's the source that we're using. It's a water-soluble, highly bioavailable source, and it's an organic source of chromium. As I mentioned, organic sources are much more bioavailable to the animal. What does chromium do in the body? We'll get into the more detail of how it works, but really it improves how the animal uses glucose. What is glucose used for in the body? Well, glucose is the fuel for nearly every function in the body, the immune function. We know that glucose plays a role in metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance, plays a role in athletic performance. Now, KemTRACE chromium is the first product of its kind on the market. Over 20 years of research on this particular product, 50 peer-reviewed research studies, and that's really key right there. Any technology that Poulin Grain brings to the table, we have to make sure that it's backed by science, and these peer-reviewed research studies aren't just done by the company, they're done in university settings and reviewed by academics across the globe. It's registered in over 35 countries. I think in our current climate, we really value the fact that it's manufactured in America and sourced from US-based ingredients. In March of 2020, just this March, so just a couple of months ago, KemTRACE chromium was approved by the FDA for use in horses. You may have seen chromium in supplements and feeds prior to this, but you won't have seen KemTRACE chromium, and if it was used prior to March 2020, then it was actually illegally used, because in March 2020 was when it was legally able to be used in horse feeds. So I think that's key. You know, we're really one of the very first to be using this in horse feeds. So I want to start out by showing us, getting us to fully understand how insulin works, because we're in the business of bringing you solutions. But in order to understand the solution, you've got to understand the problem, and in order to understand the problem, you've got to understand how it's supposed to work so that we know what we're trying to go back to. So I'm going to show you this little video.
When food is ingested, it travels along the digestive tract, where it is broken down into its component nutrients in order to be absorbed into the bloodstream. One such nutrient is glucose, a simple sugar. Glucose gets absorbed by the stomach and intestines and then enters the bloodstream. It travels through the circulation to all body cells. Once absorbed into the bloodstream, glucose circulates, causing the blood sugar level to rise. An increased level of blood sugar sends a signal to the pancreatic beta cells, which respond by secreting the hormone insulin into the circulation. Insulin is necessary for glucose to reach and be used by several important target tissues throughout the body. These include the liver, muscle, and adipose tissue. Insulin is necessary to keep blood glucose levels stable in the body. Glucose enters the cell through a process called facilitated diffusion.
Okay, so we've got a little bit of a better understanding of how glucose and insulin dynamics work. So let's start to chat about what happens when we have a breakdown in that system. So if that insulin function fails. So you can see in our graphic on the top, the normal cell, and we have those insulin receptors, and they're enabling that facilitated diffusion, that glucose, to travel through the wall, out of the bloodstream and into the muscle and off to whichever organ it's going to get used in. That's a normal cell. But then in the bottom, we see an insulin resistant cell. So these cells become resistant to the insulin being produced. Unlike type 1 diabetes in humans, where the pancreas does not secrete insulin, this is, I guess, a little more similar to type 2 diabetes, where the insulin is being produced by the pancreas, but it's not able to be used. The cells are resistant to that insulin. So you can see the red circles are the glucose and the blue are the insulin. We have all of that glucose and insulin floating around in the blood, and that's signaling the pancreas to continue to secrete insulin because it's got to get rid of all this glucose, but it's not, that insulin is not freely able to bind. It's not able to drive glucose through the cell. So we have too much insulin, and we know that too much insulin can actually cause obesity. It can be a precursor, and also other multiple diseases like Cushing's can be affected by this breakdown in insulin function. And we have hyperinsulinemia and obesity, and then this insulin resistant, and that just leads to a cascade of negative effects on the horse and disease states. You can see here, if we look at a horse after it takes a meal, and in our graph, we've got the red bars representing a normal healthy horse after he eats a meal. And you can see that his glucose, it slightly rises, but insulin is doing its job, and it's pushing glucose out of the system, out of the bloodstream, and off into the organs where it's going to be used. But the unhealthy horse, or the horse with insulin resistance, its glucose continues to rise and continues to rise because the insulin is broken. That mechanism is broken, and it's not able to clear that glucose. Some other signs that you will see is these horses are hungry and they're constantly overeating. Weight gain. They'll get these fat pads, reduced energy levels. Why reduced energy levels? Well, glucose is a primary energy substrate, and if they're not able to utilize it, then they'll have reduced energy levels. We know that inflammation these animals are in a chronic state of inflammation. Something as simple as rain rot can be exaggerated in a horse with insulin resistance because they're already in an inflamed state, so it just exacerbates that inflammation that the rain rot might cause. And we know that kind of the worst case scenarios, these horses develop laminitis. If we look at, a little bit more of a complex diagram here, looking at this equine metabolic syndrome, and we know that ponies or those horses that have that thrifty genotype, those really easy keepers, they might already, through their genetics, have a predisposition to have elevated insulin after a meal. That's just naturally in their DNA that their insulin's going to be higher. So then that itself leads them to have a propensity to be fatter, to be easier to gain weight, and develop these fat pads. You add on to that, if we go over to the top right-hand side of the slide, spring pasture or getting into the grain room and eating a high sugar and starch diet, that exacerbates that elevated insulin in an animal that genetically already has a propensity for elevated insulin. So it just is a wicked cycle here. And then that in itself leads to this insulin resistance. We have other diseases that come in that can affect insulin resistance, Cushing's disease or PPID. Chronic inflammation is seen in all of these animals. We know that pregnancy and cycling in mares, they go through this kind of decreased insulin sensitivity, if not an insulin resistant phase. And older horses or seniors just decrease their ability to deal with sugars and starches, and their insulin sensitivity starts to wane. And we know that this, if we have horses that are at risk, that genetic predisposition, or horses that are overweight, this can tip them over into the laminitic phase. So where does chromium fit in? I've mentioned that chromium plays a role in this glucose and insulin pathway, but where does it fit in? So I'll show you another little video because I think this is a great visual of how chromium can increase the role of those insulin receptors and strengthen their role.
Animal nutritionists formulate diets to provide carbohydrates as an energy source for livestock. Using different digestive processes, cows and pigs convert these carbohydrates into glucose, which is ultimately released into the bloodstream. Once in the bloodstream, glucose can reach different organs in the body. When the blood reaches the animal's pancreas, beta cells inside the pancreas detect the rising glucose levels. To reduce the glucose level, beta cells release insulin into the bloodstream. As blood circulates through the animal, insulin and glucose exit the bloodstream into tissues to reach the animal's cells. Many of the animal's cells have specific receptors on their surfaces that bind to the circulating insulin. Insulin acts like a key in a lock to open the cell by activating glucose transporters so that the circulating glucose can get inside the cell. The dietary trace element, chromium, is necessary to optimize the activation of the insulin receptor so that more glucose can get into the cell. A maximum of 4 chromium molecules may bind to one insulin receptor, which can lead to an 8-fold difference in insulin receptor activation. Adding supplemental KemTRACE chromium propionate to the diet provides the additional chromium for insulin receptor activation. Chromium enhances this reaction, causing glucose transporter activation, allowing additional glucose to enter the cell. The additional glucose will allow for more energy to be available for proper cell function. Proper functioning cells can lead to a healthier, more productive animal.
Excellent. So now we've seen, and I'll just summarize on the next slide, we have that Insulin stimulates glucose uptake, but if that insulin receptor is damaged, not working properly, we can utilize readily available chromium in the form of the KemTRACE chromium to optimize the activation of that insulin receptor or increase its ability to drive that cell uptake of glucose. The additional glucose then is available as energy to help with immune function, growth, health, performance, all those things. So we go back to that insulin resistant horse where that function, that insulin cell, glucose driving into the cell is somewhat broken. And we look at that normal cell, and that's what we're trying to go back to. We're trying to go back to glucose in the bloodstream, signals to the pancreas, secrete insulin, insulin attaches to those insulin receptors and allows that facilitated diffusion of glucose to go through into the cell. Okay, so you can see in the insulin resistant cell, if insulin is not binding to that little receptor on the side, then the channel stays closed and glucose isn't able to flow freely into the cell. So if we put chromium into the diet and it attaches to those little feet that were hanging down on that insulin receptor and kind of kickstart that insulin receptor so that the insulin will then bind to it, and now it opens up and allows that glucose to come through. So that can be very beneficial for these insulin resistant horses, so we don't have all this glucose and insulin floating around in the bloodstream causing this chronic inflammation, obesity, fat pads, those kind of disorders that end up leading to chronic inflammation and laminitis. It doesn't mean, though, that we can go ahead and add chromium to the diet and allow that horse to eat really high sugar and starch diets. It's still a big picture here. We still have to manage these horses. No, they can't eat spring pasture. They still have to be on a low carb diet, and we still have to manage them the way we were managing them before, but this just helps them clear that glucose. So let's switch gears and talk about performance, athletic performance and exercise and intensity. This is a completely new area for chromium to benefit. So we know that horses doing lower intensity exercise, trotting, slow cantering, they use close to 50-50 energy is supplied from fat and carbohydrates. But as the intensity of the exercise increases, i.e. they're doing higher speeds, then the energy substrates shift and we use significantly more carbohydrates than we do fat. So carbohydrates equal glucose in this case. So if we know in that heavily exercising horse doing high intensity exercise that they're using more glucose, and we can add chromium to the diet to enable them to push more glucose into the cell so that they continue to use more and more of it, then potentially we can have positive effects on performance. Let's also talk about stress. Stress in animals releases cortisol. That's kind of the gold standard of measuring whether something's stressed an animal. That cortisol then signals to the body, okay, you're going to have to overcome this stress. So I'm going to take away nutrients, i.e. glucose, that you might have been using for growth or lactation or performance. And now I'm going to take them and use them to overcome this stress, to kind of decrease cortisol and overcome whatever stress is occurring in the body. So that's really decreasing the horse's performance, whether that be growth performance or health performance or athletic potential. So we need to make sure that we can add chromium to the diet, and it enables, still they're going to shift some glucose to mitigating stress, but we still have a lot of glucose available for the immune system, for performance, for lactation, for growth. But again, this is a big picture, because if we look at stresses in the body, whether it be a performance horse, a growing horse, a broodmare, a stallion, you can look at every spoke on this wheel: metabolic, whether it be obesity or insulin resistance, the diet, did the hay vary, feed and water quality, toxins from mold, the environment, performance, medications, is the horse going through weaning or a situational stress like trailering them or a vet or farrier visit. You can see that at every turn in a horse's life, there is some kind of stress that we put on them. And some of these we can take away. We can really control the diet and when we feed horses and the stress involved with the management of the nutritional part of it. But people are going to trailer their horses. The horses are going to go through weaning. They're going to lactate. So there are a lot of stresses that we can't take away from horses. So like everything else in their management program, how do we just support them through those stresses if we can't completely take those stresses away? And I believe this is one part of the puzzle, adding chromium to the diet to enable them more energy coming from glucose to support that stress, to support any damage done by that stress, but also have enough to continue their performance. And when I use the term performance, I mean, growth, immune system, athletic performance. So where have we chosen to put these feeds? Well, first we're going to put them in the EquiPro line. And as we're watching this presentation, depending on your store's ordering schedule, you should have chromium in the feeds now. So in this line, we have a lot of performance horse feeds, the Performax, the Promax, the East Coast Race. These horses are all doing intense exercise. We know that these horses, whether it be traveling, trailering, going into stalls that they're not used to, that's stress on them. So that's one way that chromium is going to benefit these horses. But these horses also are doing intense exercise. So if I'm able to shunt more glucose to these animals for performance and athletic potential, then that's going to be hopefully positive on their performance outcome. Senior horses, we mentioned that senior horses just naturally, as a natural function of aging, have a decreased insulin sensitivity. They also have a decreased immune function. That's a natural function of aging. We know that our horses are living longer and longer. It's not uncommon to see 25 to 35-year-old horses, a lot of those still maybe giving lessons and still an active part of a boarding program or a lesson program. And so keeping them healthy for as long as we possibly can is really ideal. Brood mares, the mare and foal. During cycling, I mentioned that these mares can have a slightly decreased insulin sensitivity, not quite to the insulin resistant phase, but a lot of our brood mares, unfortunately, are overweight. And when you add obesity to the normal pattern of that reproductive cycle, then we get mares that during their cycle will go into phases of insulin resistance. What does that do in a cycling mare? It makes her hold on to her corpus luteum. So if she doesn't get pregnant, which when an insulin resistant mare is difficult, and she'll hold on to that CL and she won't start to cycle again. She won't produce follicles, so you can't rebreed her. So that's very detrimental in a broodmare program. Growing foals, well, we know that growing foals, our whole goal is just boosting that immune function and supporting growth. Growth in itself is stressful on animals. Lactation takes a lot of energy. Our mares need to have, that's a time in a horse's life where they have some of the most highest nutrient, be it calorie and protein and nutrient requirements out of any physiological state. So if you're able to shunt more glucose towards milk production and immune function, that's very beneficial to that mare. The other place we're going to put it is the E-Tech line. We've positioned this as our low-carb performance line. And again, we have the FiberMax, the E-Tech 1, even the senior low-carb is being fed to some of our aged performance horses. And so, number one, we're able to shunt more glucose to those performance horses, but also mitigate stress. A lot of horses that are, say, on FiberMax and aren't on Performax or Promax, is maybe they're competing at a higher level, but they have some sensitivities to sugars and starches. So adding the chromium is kind of threefold for them. Senior horses, again, we've got the senior low carb. This really was brought into the marketplace when all of the research came out about senior horses and their decreased insulin sensitivity. So it's great for those senior horses that have issues with glucose and insulin sensitivity. And then, of course, the carb safe, the ETEC balancer, and the ETEC 1 are all feeds that we routinely recommend to horses with active metabolic issues, improving that blood glucose transport in that metabolic syndrome horse. So we have a lot of resources. I know that tonight has probably been just brain overload. There's a lot of information here, but Dahlia, one of the members of the Poulin Grain team, has done a fantastic job putting together infographics and pieces that you can just read on your own. This presentation will be available online, but show that you can go to on your own and read a little bit more. So I want to show you exactly where you would go to find them. So if you go to www.poulingrain.com, and in the top right-hand corner of your screen, you'll have menu and feeds in 3 lines. If you click on that, it'll bring you to this page. And at the very bottom of all these little icons, there's an icon that says resources. Click there, and you can find all kinds of goodies here. You can find out articles that Dr. Dern and myself have read about amino acids, about Care EQ, fantastic calcium source, but also our chromium is listed here. And also a new addition to the resources is this blog. So if you click on blog, you can find all kinds of articles written there in blog form. So with that, I'm very appreciative that you've all listened in tonight. We've had great attendance. It's a really cool new ingredient that we're excited to be one of the first to add to the feeds. We really are, I think, leading animal nutrition.